The sun over Redemption Creek bleached the sky to a pale, unforgiving white. Dust, fine as ground bone, settled on everything on the weary wooden storefronts that leaned against each other for support on the sweat-slicked flanks of tethered horses, and on the quiet man who moved through the heat with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived under its harsh gaze. Jedidiah Cole, 34 years old and weathered beyond his time, tied his gelding to the hitching post outside the mercantile. His face was a map of sun-etched lines, his eyes the color of a faded blue sky, constantly scanning, assessing, missing nothing. He had come for flour salt and the blessed anonymity of a town that knew nothing of the man he used to be. For him, silence was a fortress. Silence was a... He tipped his hat to the storekeeper, a balding man named Henderson, whose apron was permanently dusted with flour, and began gathering his supplies. The air inside was thick with the smells of cured leather, dried beans, and old wood. Through the large front window, the town's main street baked in the afternoon glare. A woman with a parasol hurried across the dusty thoroughfare. Two old men played checkers on a barrel outside the saloon. It was a scene of placid, predictable frontier life, the very reason Jedidiah had chosen this quiet corner of the world to bury his past. Then the world shattered. The first sound was the splintering of glass from the bank across the street, a sharp, violent crack that sliced through the afternoon torpor. It was followed instantly by a woman's scream, high, thin, and full of pure terror. Henderson froze his hand, hovering over a sack of coffee beans. Jedidiah's head snapped up, his body tensing with an instinct he had spent years trying to suppress. His hand of its own accord drifted toward his hip, where a phantom weight used to rest. Chaos erupted in the street. Panicked townsfolk scrambled for cover, their shouts and cries a discordant symphony of fear. An overturned vegetable cart spilled its contents across the road, apples and potatoes rolling in the dust. From the bank emerged three figures, bandanas pulled high over their faces, gunmetal glinting in the ruthless sun. The man in the lead was different. He moved with a languid, almost theatrical grace, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of his men. He was tall, dressed in a black duster that billowed around him like a crow's wing, and even from a distance, Jedidiah could feel the cold charisma radiating from him. This was Silas Blackwood, though Jedidiah did not yet know his name. He only knew he was looking at a predator. As Jedidiah watched from the mercantile's doorway, his gaze caught on a woman and a small child, pinned down behind an overturned wagon, directly in the line of fire. The woman's dress, a pale calico, was a stark target against the dark wood of the wagon. She held the little girl tight against her, her body a fragile shield. Jedidiah saw the terror in her eyes, a familiar gut-wrenching sight that threw him back to a time he fought daily to forget. Silas Blackwood and his men were backing toward their horses, firing warning shots into the air and at the doorways of nearby buildings to keep the townsfolk at bay. A stray bullet ricocheted off the blacksmith's anvil, with a high-pitched whine striking the wagon mere inches from the woman's head. She flinched violently, pulling her daughter even closer. Inside the bank, in the seconds before his escape, Silas had paused. His eyes had swept over the terrified clerks and customers, a flicker of amusement in their depths. On a teller's desk, a small, ornate silver locket on a delicate chain had caught the light. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he snatched it up not for its monetary value, but for the simple, arrogant pleasure of the taking. It was a trophy, a memento of his dominion over this small, helpless town. As he strode out into the sunlight, stuffing sacks of money into his saddlebags, he brushed past the overturned wagon. He barely registered the woman and child cowering there. The locket, slick in his gloved hand, slipped from his grasp and fell into the dust near the woman's worn boots. He didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying the fear in the air, the beautiful orchestrated chaos of it all. Jedidiah saw it happen. He saw the flash of silver, the woman's terrified eyes, the child's whimpering form. The old instincts, the lawman's righteous fire he thought long extinguished, roared back to life. He couldn't stand by. He couldn't be the man who did nothing. Acting without thought, he grabbed a heavy crate of tinned goods from the mercantile's porch. With a guttural roar that surprised even himself, he heaved it into the street. It crashed onto the hard-packed earth with a deafening clatter, tins rolling in every direction. The sound was a sudden, unexpected explosion in the cacophony. Silas Blackwood's head whipped around his eyes, instantly locking onto the source of the diversion. For a split second, the two men's gazes met across the dust-choked street. Jedidiah saw a flash of cold, intelligent appraisal in the outlaw's eyes, a flicker of something that was not just anger, but recognition, as if he were seeing not just a man, but a ghost. The diversion worked. Blackwood's men, startled, turned their attention to Jedidiah, giving the woman the precious seconds she needed. Scrambling to her feet, she pulled her daughter with her and darted into the narrow alley between the mercantile and the assay office. She was gone. Silas held up a hand, stopping his men from firing on Jedidiah. A slow, unnerving smile spread beneath his bandana. He gave a slight, mocking nod, an acknowledgement of a worthy opponent in a game only he understood. Then, with a sharp whistle, he and his men mounted their horses and thundered out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and a terrified silence in their wake. The chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun, replaced by a stunned, trembling quiet. Jedidiah stood on the porch, his heart hammering against his ribs, the adrenaline singing in his veins. The old feeling was back, the weight of responsibility, the burden of action. He had tried to escape it, but it had found him here in this quiet, forgotten place. His eyes were drawn to the alley where the woman and child had disappeared. He felt a pull, an unwanted connection to the terror he had seen in her eyes. He had saved them from the immediate danger, but he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had just stepped back into a world he had sworn to leave behind. Silas Blackwood had seen him, and a man like that did not forget a face. The fortress of his silence had been breached. The town of Redemption Creek held its breath for a long moment before tentatively coming back to life. People emerged from doorways, their faces pale, their voices a low, shaken murmur. Henderson, the storekeeper, clutched a broom handle like a rifle, his knuckles white. The sheriff, a portly man named Gable, whose primary duties usually involved settling disputes over stray cattle, bustled out of his office, looking flustered and overwhelmed. Jedidiah paid him no mind. His focus remained on the dark maw of the alley. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the scattered tins and broken glass. He felt the townsfolk's eyes on him, curious, wary, grateful. He ignored them. He was not their hero. He was just a man who had acted on an impulse he now deeply regretted. He found them huddled at the far end of the alley behind a stack of rain barrels. The little girl was sobbing quietly into her mother's skirt, her small body trembling. The woman Elizabeth, though he did not know her name yet, was trying to soothe her, but her own hands were shaking uncontrollably. Her face was smudged with dirt, her pale hair coming loose from its pins, and her eyes were wide with shock. When she saw Jedidiah's long shadow fall over them, she flinched, pulling her daughter Myra closer. "It's over," Jedidiah said, his voice rougher than he intended. "They're gone." She looked up at him, her gaze darting from his face to the street and back again, as if she couldn't trust the sudden quiet. Gratitude warred with fear in her expression. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You saved us." "Just keep your head down," he advised gruffly, turning to leave. He had done his part. He wanted no more involvement, no connection. His supplies were paid for. It was time to retreat to his cabin, to the safety of his solitude. He was halfway to his horse when he heard a desperate cry behind him. "Wait, please." He stopped, his back still to her, his jaw tight. He did not turn around. "Our wagon. They shot our horse." Her voice cracked with despair. "It's dead. We have nowhere to go. My husband's family. They live just outside town. They..." They told us to leave. They won't take us back. The story tumbled out of her in a broken, shame-filled torrent. Her husband had died of fever a month prior. His family, stern and unforgiving, had seen her and her daughter as little more than extra mouths to feed burdens to be cast off. They had given her a broken-down wagon, a sway-backed old horse, and a few dollars, and pointed her down the trail, telling her not to return. The bank robbery had been the final cruel blow of fate. Jedidiah remained silent, his shoulders rigid. Every word she spoke was a chain binding him further to a situation he wanted no part of. He knew the type of people she spoke of, hard people made harder by a hard land, who saw compassion as a weakness. "Please, mister," she begged, her footsteps soft in the dust behind him. "We can't stay here. The sheriff, everyone. They'll just send us away. Is there a place we can rest just for the night?" He finally turned his face a mask of stone. He looked at the woman, her pride shattered, her hope dwindling. He looked at the little girl peeking out from behind her mother's skirts, her tear-streaked face smudged with dirt, a bright blue ribbon in her hair, now askew. Her eyes wide and trusting, fixed on him. And in that moment, Jedidiah's resolve crumbled. He saw not a stranger, but a reflection of every soul he had failed to protect in his former life. The ghosts of his past whispered that he could not fail again. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he gave a short, curt nod. "My cabin's a few miles north of here. You can stay till you figure things out." He didn't offer comfort or kindness, only a practical solution. It was all he had to give. Relief washed over Elizabeth's face so intensely it seemed she might collapse. "Thank you," she breathed, clutching Myra's hand. "We won't be a burden. I swear it." The word hung in the air between them. Burden. It was the same word the child had used, a brand seared onto their spirits. Jedidiah hated the sound of it. Without another word, he untied his horse, led it over to them, and swung himself into the saddle. He reached down a hand first for the little girl. Myra hesitated for a second, then placed her small hand in his and allowed him to lift her up, seating her in front of him on the saddle. He then offered his hand to Elizabeth. She took it, her touch light and trembling, and he easily pulled her up to sit behind him, her arms circling his waist for balance. Her grip was tentative, as if she were afraid to presume too much. The horse shifted uneasily under the weight of three, but Jedidiah's steady hand on the reins calmed it. He guided the animal away from the main street, taking a back trail that skirted the edge of town, avoiding the prying eyes and inevitable questions. As Redemption Creek disappeared behind them, the vast, silent expanse of the prairie opened up. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. The only sounds were the plodding of the horse's hooves and the soft, exhausted breaths of the woman and child he carried. The trail to his cabin seemed longer that day. The silence was not the comfortable solitude he was used to. It was filled with the fragile presence of two lives now tangled with his own. He could feel Elizabeth's weariness through her light hold, could feel Myra's small body leaning against him, her initial fear giving way to a child's simple trust. When the cabin came into view, a lone structure of weathered logs, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods by a shallow creek, Myra pointed a small finger. "Is that it? Is that our home?" The question, so innocent and hopeful, struck Jedidiah with unexpected force. "It's a place to rest," he corrected gently. He dismounted and lifted Myra to the ground, then turned to help Elizabeth. For a moment, as his hands spanned her waist to help her down, their eyes met. He saw the deep, soul-crushing exhaustion in her gaze, the shame, and beneath it, a flicker of resilient strength. He quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment. He carried their single battered satchel inside and laid it on the floor. The cabin was sparse and impeccably clean, containing little more than a bed, a table with two chairs, a stone hearth, and shelves holding a few books and provisions. It was the home of a man who needed little and wanted less. "You and the girl can take the bed," he stated, not offering. He gestured toward the hearth. "I'll make some food." Elizabeth stood hesitantly in the center of the room, clutching Myra's hand, looking small and out of place in the masculine space. We don't have much to offer in return." "I didn't ask for anything," he replied, his back to her as he stoked the embers in the hearth. He moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, preparing a simple meal of bacon and beans. Myra, her curiosity overcoming her shyness, explored the single room, her fingers tracing the patterns in the wooden table. Elizabeth sank onto one of the chairs, her body finally succumbing to the day's trauma, her shoulders slumping in defeat. As they ate in near silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of spoons against tin plates, Jedidiah felt the walls of his carefully constructed solitude closing in. He had brought them here to ease a momentary pang of conscience, intending it to be a temporary arrangement. But as he watched Elizabeth gently coaxing her daughter to eat her movements, full of a weary protective love, a disquieting thought took root in his mind. This was not a problem that could be solved overnight. And the face of Silas Blackwood, with its intelligent assessing eyes, lingered in his memory. Trouble was coming. He had not escaped his past. He had just invited it over his threshold. Later, after Elizabeth had tucked a sleeping Myra into his bed, she stood by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself. The flames cast dancing shadows on her face, highlighting the dark bruises left not by the robbery, but by the hands of family who had cast her out. "He had a silver locket," she said suddenly, her voice low. "The man in charge. It fell when he passed me. I picked it up." From the pocket of her dress, she pulled the ornate locket. It gleamed in the firelight. Jedidiah looked at it, his expression unreadable. "You should have left it. I don't know why I took it." She confessed, her fingers closing around it. It felt important somehow. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "They'll be looking for you, won't they? Because of what you did." He didn't answer. He simply took a spare blanket from a chest and spread it on the floor near the hearth. His silence was her answer. Yes, they would be looking, and they would find him. As he settled down for the night, the weight of his old life pressing down on him like a shroud, he knew that the quiet days were over. He was no longer just Jedidiah Cole Homesteader. He was a man with something to protect. The first days in the cabin unfolded in a delicate, unspoken truce. A rhythm of quiet coexistence settled over them, fragile as a spider's web. Jedidiah would rise before dawn, his movements hushed so as not to wake his guests. He would work his small plot of land, mend his fences, and tend to his horse, finding a familiar solace in the physical labor. Yet his solitude was different now. It was punctuated by the sound of a child's laughter drifting from the cabin, or the sight of Elizabeth hanging laundry on a line he had strung between two cottonwoods. His world, once a monochrome landscape of duty and survival, now had flickers of color. Elizabeth, for her part, tried to make herself useful to erase the brand of burden from her spirit. She was a ghost in the corners of his life, at first sweeping the floor when he was outside mending his shirts with tiny, neat stitches and preparing meals from his modest stores. She spoke little, her voice often trailing off, as if she expected to be silenced. Her shame was a physical presence, curving her shoulders inward and keeping her eyes downcast. She flinched from kindness, treating his simple provisions of food and shelter as a debt she could never repay. "You should rest," Jedidiah would say, his voice gruff, when he found her scrubbing the floorboards on her hands and knees long after Myra was asleep. "I have to earn my keep," she would reply, not looking at him. "We can't be a weight on you." The words were a constant quiet friction between them. He wanted to tell her that her presence was not a weight, that the sound of her humming softly to Myra was a balm to a silence he hadn't realized was so profound. But the words were foreign to him, buried under years of martial steel and self-imposed exile. So instead, he communicated in actions. He would leave a bucket of fresh well water by the door for her each morning. He carved a small, detailed wooden horse for Myra, and the look of pure joy on the child's face when she received it was a reward he hadn't known he was seeking. Myra was the bridge between their two islands of silence. Unburdened by adult shame, she accepted Jedidiah's quiet presence with a child's simple faith. She would follow him as he worked, asking endless questions about the clouds, the creek, and the horse. He would answer in short, direct sentences, yet he never sent her away. He found himself watching for her, listening for the patter of her small feet. She brought a lightness to the cabin that it had never known. But the sanctuary of the homestead was not impenetrable. A week after their arrival, their supplies ran low. A trip to Redemption Creek was unavoidable. "I can stay here." Elizabeth offered, immediately, panic flickering in her eyes. "Myra and I will be fine." "No, Jedidiah," said his tone, leaving no room for argument. "It's not safe. You come with me." He was thinking of Silas Blackwood, whose shadow seemed to stretch all the way from whatever den he occupied to the door of this cabin. The town felt different this time. As they rode in, Jedidiah felt the shift immediately. Heads turned. Conversations ceased, replaced by hushed whispers that followed them like a swarm of insects. The story of the bank robbery had been told and retold, and the tale of the quiet homesteader who had intervened had grown with each telling. But now that story had a new chapter, the woman and child he had taken in. On the boardwalk, two women in starched bonnets paused their conversation, their eyes raking over Elizabeth with open disapproval. One leaned toward the other and whispered loud enough to be heard, "Shameless, isn't it? A widow barely a month and already shacked up with another man." Heat flooded Elizabeth's cheeks. She instinctively pulled Myra closer, her body tensing as if to absorb the blow. Jedidiah's hand rested briefly on the small of her back, a silent, steadying gesture, before he guided them into the mercantile. Inside, the atmosphere was even colder. Henderson, the storekeeper, nodded curtly to Jedidiah, but pointedly ignored Elizabeth. As she reached for a sack of flour, another customer, a stout rancher's wife, deliberately stepped in front of her, turning her back. The message was clear: "You are not welcome here." Elizabeth's hands trembled so badly, she dropped a tin of peaches, which clattered loudly on the wooden floor. The sound drew every eye in the store. Myra, seeing her mother's distress, quickly bent to retrieve it, her small face flushed with a second-hand shame she was too young to understand. Jedidiah knelt beside her. He took the tin from Myra's small hands and placed it firmly on the counter. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the other customers. He simply fixed Henderson with a hard, unwavering stare. "We need flour, salt, coffee, and a bag of penny candy for the girl." His voice, low and calm, cut through the hostile silence. It was not a request. It was a command. The storekeeper, flustered by the intensity of Jedidiah's gaze, hurried to fill the order. The other shoppers looked away, suddenly finding the contents of the shelves fascinating. As Jedidiah paid his coins ringing loudly on the countertop, he saw the glint of his old U.S. Marshal badge in his mind's eye. He had once commanded respect with the authority of the law. Now he commanded it with sheer force of will. He hated that it was still necessary. The ride back to the cabin was heavy with unspoken words. Elizabeth sat rigid behind him, the town's judgment, a physical weight on her shoulders. Myra was uncharacteristically quiet, sensing her mother's pain. That night, after Myra was asleep, Elizabeth confronted him. She stood before him by the hearth, her posture straight, her voice trembling, but resolute. "This can't continue, Jedidiah. You see what they think? They'll tarnish your name. They'll make you an outcast just like me. Their opinions don't put food on the table or keep the fire lit." He stated, his eyes on the flames. "But they matter. she insisted, her voice rising with desperate energy. "They matter in a place like this. I was called a curse by my husband's own mother, a weight that would drag any man down. I will not do that to you. I will not be your ruin." He finally looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded in his eyes. "What if I told you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "that my life was already in ruins long before you came along?" The confession hung in the air between them, shocking in its vulnerability. Before she could respond, he stood and walked to the small, dusty window that overlooked the dark prairie. He stared out into the night, his back to her, a man silhouetted against a vast emptiness. The walls of his fortress were beginning to crack. Unseen by Elizabeth, his hand clenched into a fist at his side. He was having the nightmares again. They came almost every night now since the robbery. The same scene replayed in flashes of smoke and terror, a sun-scorched canyon, the shouts of a posse, the panicked face of a boy no older than 16, and the deafening final crack of a rifle. He would always wake up in a cold sweat, the boy's terrified eyes burned into his memory. The boy's name was Thomas, and Jedidiah had led the posse that killed him. He turned back from the window. Elizabeth was still watching him, her expression a mixture of confusion and a dawning, fearful understanding. He had protected her from the town, but he knew with chilling certainty that he could not protect her from the ghosts that were riding hard to catch up with him. And the leader of that ghostly posse had a name: Silas Blackwood. The weeks that followed were a tense calm before a storm Jedidiah could feel gathering on the horizon. He began to sleep lightly, a rifle propped near his cot on the floor, his ears tuned to the night sounds of the prairie. He was no longer just a homesteader. He was a sentry. He taught Elizabeth how to load and fire the small pistol he kept in a drawer, ignoring the fear in her eyes as she held the cold, heavy metal. "A woman on her own needs to know," was all he said, his voice flat, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. During the day, a fragile domesticity took root. Myra's laughter became a constant, chasing the shadows from the cabin's corners. Elizabeth, seeing the deep exhaustion in Jedidiah's eyes, began to assert herself in small ways. She insisted on taking watches at night, sitting by the window with the pistol across her lap, while he slept, her fear overcome by a fierce, protective instinct. A silent partnership was being forged between them, born of shared threat and unspoken affection. One afternoon, while cleaning out a small wooden chest of Jedidiah's old belongings to make room for her and Myra's few things, Elizabeth came across a tarnished silver star, a U.S. Marshal's badge. She picked it up, its weight surprising, its edges worn smooth. She looked over at Jedidiah, who was outside splitting logs, his axe rising and falling with a powerful, relentless rhythm. It explained so much: his quiet authority, his watchfulness, the ghosts she sometimes saw flicker in his eyes. It also terrified her. Lawmen made powerful enemies. She was about to put it back when her fingers brushed against something else in the chest, a faded, folded tintype photograph. Curious, she opened it. It was a picture of a group of grim-faced men on horseback rifles held at the ready. A posse. Her breath caught in her throat. In the center of the group, younger and harder looking, was Jedidiah. But it was the man next to him that made her heart stop. It was her late husband, Daniel. He looked so young, his face taut, with a mixture of excitement and fear she had never seen before. She sank to the floor, the photograph trembling in her hand. Daniel had never spoken much of his life before they met, only that he had ridden with the law for a time, that he'd seen things he wanted to forget. Her in-laws had been equally tight-lipped, their silence a wall she could never penetrate. Now a piece of that wall had crumbled. Her past and Jedidiah's were connected in a way she couldn't comprehend. But the discovery filled her with a profound sense of dread. She quickly hid the photograph and the badge, her mind reeling. She said nothing to Jedidiah. The knowledge was a heavy secret, another layer of silence in a house already full of them. She found herself studying him, searching for clues for the man her husband had known. The storm broke on a hot, windless afternoon. Jedidiah was returning from checking his traps along the creek when he saw the lone rider. The man was sitting on his horse on the ridge overlooking the cabin, a still dark silhouette against the bright sky. He wore a black duster, and even from a distance, Jedidiah recognized the arrogant slump of his shoulders. It was Silas Blackwood. He wasn't there to raid or to steal. He was there to be seen. It was a statement. I know where you live. I know what you have. Jedidiah's blood ran cold. He pulled his horse into the cover of the cottonwoods, his hand going to the rifle in its scabbard. Blackwood sat there for a long, silent minute, then slowly turned his horse and rode away. That night, the cabin was a fortress under siege. Jedidiah barred the door and shuttered the windows. He didn't have to explain. Elizabeth had seen the rider too, and the look on Jedidiah's face had told her everything she needed to know. They sat in the dim firelight, Myra sleeping between them, the loaded pistol on the table. "Who is he?" Elizabeth finally whispered, breaking the tense silence. Jedidiah stared into the fire, his face grim. The time for secrets was over. His name is Silas Blackwood, and he's not after money. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He's after me. And then the story came out, not in a torrent, but in clipped, painful sentences like stones being pulled from a deep, dark well. Years ago, when he was a marshal, he had been tasked with hunting down a gang of ruthless train robbers. They had tracked them to a box canyon, cornered them. A firefight erupted. In the chaos, a young boy had ridden out from the outlaws' camp caught in the crossfire. He was Silas's younger brother, Thomas, an innocent boy in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was just a kid. Jedidiah's voice was hoarse with old grief. He wasn't part of the gang. He was just bringing them food. But in the smoke, no one could tell. A shot was fired. He went down. He paused, the memory twisting his features. I led that posse. It was my command. His death is on my hands. He fell silent. Elizabeth stared at him, her heart aching for the pain he had carried for so long. Then a chilling realization dawned on her, connecting his story to the photograph in the chest. My husband. Daniel. She began, her voice barely a whisper. He was with you, wasn't he? He was in that posse. Jedidiah looked up, his eyes wide with shock. How did you know that? I found a photograph. Her voice broke. Oh, Jedidiah. Was he? Jedidiah's face hardened, but he couldn't hide the grim truth in his eyes. He gave a slow, solemn nod. It was Daniel's rifle that fired the shot, Elizabeth. He never meant to. The boy rode out of the dust right into his line of sight. It was a tragic accident. But Silas Blackwood doesn't believe in accidents. The full, horrifying truth crashed down on Elizabeth. It all made sense now. Her in-laws' shame, their fear, their desperate need to cast her and Myra out after Daniel's death. They weren't just ridding themselves of a burden. They were trying to sever a tie to a terrible past, terrified that Silas Blackwood's vengeance would one day find them. Her sense of being a curse, a harbinger of ruin, was not just a feeling, it was a truth they had all believed. So this whole time she breathed, her hand going to her mouth. He's been hunting you. Not to kill you. No, Jedidiah finished, his voice grim. Worse. He wants me to feel what he felt. He wants to take away everyone and everything I care about, just like he believes I did to him. The bank robbery. That was just to draw me out. To see if I still had a conscience. To see if there was anything left in my life worth destroying. He looked at her, and then at the sleeping form of Myra, and the unspoken implication was terrifyingly clear. And now he's found it. In the flickering firelight, they were no longer just a man, a woman, and a child. They were the last stand against a ghost from the past, a debt of blood that had finally come due. The love that had been growing between them in whispers and quiet gestures was now forged in the crucible of a shared, deadly threat. There was no running. There was no hiding. There was only the coming storm. The world outside the cabin shrank. The prairie, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a cage, with Silas Blackwood as the patient predator circling its perimeter. Every gust of wind, rattling the shutters, every coyote's cry in the distance, sounded like a footstep in the dark. Jedidiah became a creature of pure vigilance. He rarely slept, his nights spent staring into the darkness from the cabin window, his rifle a permanent extension of his arm. The easy rhythm of their days was gone, replaced by a taut, humming tension. Elizabeth found a strength she didn't know she possessed. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce primal need to protect her daughter and the man who had become her world. The revelation of Daniel's involvement had not driven a wedge between her and Jedidiah. It had fused them together. They were bound by the same tragedy, victims of the same ghost. Her shame, the weight she had carried for so long, finally lifted, replaced by a clear, righteous anger. It was never her fault. It was a cruel twist of fate, and Silas Blackwood's grief had curdled into a poison that threatened to consume them all. "He won't have her," she said to Jedidiah one evening, her voice low and steady as she watched Myra sleep. "He will not touch my daughter." Jedidiah looked at her, seeing not the broken woman he had found on the trail, but a formidable partner. "No," he agreed, his hand finding hers in the dim light. "He won't." They knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Blackwood was playing a game, tightening the noose, enjoying their fear. The final confrontation was inevitable. The only question was where and when. The answer came 3 days later, carried on the wind. A dust storm was brewing in the west, the sky turning a bruised, yellowish gray. A rider approached the cabin, not with the stealth of an outlaw, but openly carrying a white flag of truce. It was Holt, the neighbor, who had warned Jedidiah about taking Elizabeth in. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Blackwood's in town," Holt said, not daring to dismount. "He and his men, they've taken over the saloon. He wants you, Cole. He says to come alone. If you don't, he says the whole town will pay the price. He's already got the sheriff locked in his own cell." Jedidiah's face was grim. It was a classic tactic, turn the community against the target. "Isolate him. There's more." Holt stammered, his gaze dropping to the ground. He sent a message. For her. He looked at Elizabeth, who had come to the doorway. "He says a debt was left unpaid by a man named Daniel, and he means to collect it from his next of kin." The threat was clear. It wasn't just about Jedidiah anymore. It was about Myra. Before either of them could react, a blur of movement came from the side of the cabin. 2 of Blackwood's men, who had used Holt as a diversion, burst from the cover of the cottonwoods. One grabbed Elizabeth, while the other snatched Myra, who had been playing by the creek. Myra screamed a sound of pure terror that ripped through Jedidiah's soul. He raised his rifle, but the man holding Myra pressed a pistol to her head. "Don't be a fool, Marshal," the man sneered. "The boss wants to see you, in town, now, or the girl's debt gets paid in full." Rage, cold and absolute, washed over Jedidiah. He looked at Elizabeth's terrified face, at his daughter. His daughter, he realized with fierce certainty, crying in the arms of a monster. He had no choice. "Let the woman go," Jedidiah said, his voice dangerously calm. "I'll come. Just let her go." The outlaw grinned, shoving Elizabeth toward him. She stumbled and fell. Jedidiah caught her, his eyes never leaving the men. As they mounted their horses, Myra held tightly in front of one of them. They rode off toward town without looking back. Elizabeth scrambled to her feet, her face a mask of horror. Jedidiah, no, it's a trap. I know, he said, checking the cylinders of his revolver. He looked at her, his eyes full of a pain she had never seen before. Stay here. Bar the door. Whatever happens, you keep yourself safe. I'm coming with you, she cried, grabbing the pistol he had taught her to use. No, he commanded, his voice steel. Myra needs one of us to come back for her. He pressed his forehead against hers for a barest second, a desperate, silent farewell. I will bring our daughter home. He swung himself onto his horse and spurred it into a gallop, riding headlong into the approaching storm. The wind was rising, whipping dust into the air, obscuring the sun. The world was dissolving into a brown, howling chaos, a perfect mirror of the tempest in his own heart. He was no longer running from his past. He was riding to meet it, to a final reckoning in a town called Redemption Creek. The town was a ghost of itself. Dust swirled through the empty main street, seeping through the cracks of the shuttered buildings. The wind howled like a hungry animal, tearing at signs and rattling windows. At the end of the street, the saloon was the only place showing signs of life, its batwing doors swinging violently in the gale yellow light, spilling out into the brown gloom. This was Silas Blackwood's stage. Jedidiah dismounted his duster, whipping around him. He left his rifle in its scabbard. This was not a battle of long-range fire, but a confrontation of wills. He checked his Colt, the familiar weight, a cold comfort in his hand, and strode toward the saloon. The doors banged open as he approached, as if inviting him in. The air inside was thick with the smell of whiskey-stale smoke and fear. Blackwood's men were positioned around the room, their guns drawn. The townsfolk, Henderson Holt, Sheriff Gable, and a dozen others were huddled together against the far wall, their faces pale. Silas Blackwood stood alone at the center of the room, behind the main card table. He was holding Myra on his lap. She wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at the door, her small face streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with a terror that made Jedidiah's blood boil. On the table in front of them lay the silver locket. Marshal Cole Silas greeted him, his voice smooth and pleasant, a chilling contrast to the scene. I was beginning to think you wouldn't accept my invitation. Please come in. Join our little party. Jedidiah walked slowly toward the center of the room, his boots echoing on the floorboards. His eyes were locked on Myra. Let the child go, Blackwood. This is between you and me. Silas chuckled, a low melodic sound. Oh, but that's where you're wrong. This is about all of us. About old debts and the ghosts they leave behind. He ran a gentle hand over Myra's hair. The child flinched. Such a beautiful child. She has her father's eyes, don't you think? He pushed the locket across the table. Her mother was kind enough to hold on to this for me. A memento. This ends now, Jedidiah said, his voice a low growl. You and me. Patience, Marshal. A story should be told to its end. Silas said, his eyes glittering with a feverish intensity. He gestured to the huddled townsfolk. These good people deserve to know who their quiet neighbor really is. They deserve to know the story of Thomas Blackwood. He told them everything about his innocent brother, the botched raid, the death in the canyon. His voice was filled with a performer's sorrow, captivating and venomous. This man, he said, pointing at Jedidiah, led the posse that murdered my brother. He took the only family I had in this world. Then he turned his cold gaze on the townsfolk. But he didn't act alone. He had help. One of his men was a local boy, a man whose family still lives just outside this town, a man named Daniel. He paused, letting the name hang in the air. The man who pulled the trigger. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Elizabeth's in-laws, who had been forced into the saloon with the others, shrank back, their faces ashen with shame and terror. His family, consumed by their cowardice, cast out his wife and child, hoping to wash the stain of his actions away. Silas continued, his voice dripping with contempt. But blood debts don't wash away, do they, Marshal? They must be paid. He stood up, pulling Myra with him, using her small body as a shield. And so we come to the final act. You have a choice, Jedidiah. You can uphold the law you once served. You can try to arrest me and watch this innocent child pay for her father's sins. He pressed the muzzle of his pistol against Myra's temple. Or you can embrace the vengeance that I know burns in your heart. Kill me. Become the monster everyone here will believe you to be. Either way you lose. You lose your honor, or you lose your daughter. The same choice you forced upon me all those years ago. The saloon was silent, save for the howling wind outside. Jedidiah stood frozen, caught in an impossible dilemma. His past and future, his redemption and his damnation, all hinged on this single moment. He looked at Myra's terrified face, her eyes pleading with him. He saw Elizabeth's face in his mind, heard her voice. I will bring our daughter home. He had to choose. Not revenge. Not the old way of blood for blood that had destroyed both him and Silas. He had to choose the future. He had to choose redemption. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the floor with a heavy thud. You're wrong, Silas. Jedidiah said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension. My debt isn't to you. It's to him. To Thomas. I've spent years paying for my failure to protect an innocent boy. I won't fail another one. He took a step forward, his hands raised and empty. Let her go, and I will stand trial with you. I will testify to my part in it. The law you despise can be the only thing that brings justice for your brother. Silas stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief, his entire narrative of righteous vengeance crumbling. This wasn't the broken, vengeful man he had hunted for years. This was something else. His grip on Myra faltered for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening Jedidiah needed. He dove forward, not at Silas, but at the heavy card table, upending it with a powerful shove. Cards, whiskey glasses, and the silver locket flew into the air. The crash and the surprise of the move caused Silas to stumble back. Myra, freed from his grasp, scrambled away toward the terrified townsfolk. In that instant, everything exploded. Blackwood's men opened fire. Jedidiah rolled behind the overturned table, grabbing his fallen gun belt. The townsfolk screamed, diving for cover. Sheriff Gable, galvanized by Jedidiah's courage, pulled a hidden derringer from his boot and fired, taking one of the outlaws down. The saloon became a maelstrom of smoke, splintering wood, and thunderous gunfire. Jedidiah moved with the lethal grace of the lawman he once was, his shots precise, aimed not to kill, but to incapacitate. He was a man redeemed, fighting not for vengeance, but for the future. Silas, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage at being denied his perfect tragic ending, fired wildly at Jedidiah. But his game was over. As he turned to make a final desperate stand, a single shot rang out from the saloon's doorway. It struck the pistol from Silas's hand, sending it clattering across the floor. Everyone froze. Standing in the doorway, framed against the swirling dust of the storm, was Elizabeth. Her face was pale but determined, the small pistol held steady in both hands. The storm had not stopped her. Love had given her the courage to ride through it. Silas stared at his empty, bleeding hand, then at the woman who had disarmed him. He looked at Jedidiah, rising from behind the table. He looked at Myra, safe in the arms of the sheriff. He was surrounded, defeated. The great tragic story of Silas Blackwood had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, steely resolve of a family that refused to be broken. The fight was over. As the dust storm abated, so too did the chaos in Redemption Creek. The wind died down, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and cool. In the aftermath of the saloon showdown, Silas Blackwood and his remaining men were locked securely in the sheriff's cells. Their reign of fear brought to an end, not by a lone avenger, but by a community that had found its courage. Jedidiah emerged from the saloon, Myra held tightly in his arms. She was clinging to him, her face buried in his shoulder, her small body still trembling. He walked directly to Elizabeth, who rushed to meet them. The three of them came together in the middle of the dusty street, a silent, desperate embrace that spoke more than words ever could. They were a family forged in fear and loss, and now finally whole. The townsfolk slowly emerged from the saloon, their expressions a mixture of awe and respect. Henderson, the storekeeper, Sheriff Gable, even Holt. They looked at Jedidiah differently now. He was no longer the quiet, aloof outsider. He was the man who had faced down a demon from his past to protect them all, choosing justice over vengeance. The whispers of scorn that had followed Elizabeth were replaced by murmurs of admiration. She was not the shameless widow, but the brave woman who had stood with him. Their social exile was over. In the quiet days that followed, a profound peace settled over the small cabin by the creek. The ghosts had been faced, and though the memories remained, they no longer had the power to haunt. Jedidiah and Elizabeth talked for hours, sharing the stories of their pasts, filling in the silent spaces that had existed between them. She learned of the man he had been, the weight he had carried, and he learned of the quiet strength that had allowed her to survive a lifetime of being told she was worthless. Elizabeth, finally free from the shame that had defined her, blossomed. A genuine smile touched her lips more often, and the light returned to her eyes. She moved with a new confidence, no longer a guest in Jedidiah's home, but its heart. The knowledge that her husband's death was tied to this tragedy was a sorrow she would always carry, but it was no longer a mark of her own failure. It was simply a part of a larger, more complex story, a story that had, against all odds, led her to this place of safety and love. A week later, Jedidiah hitched his horse to the wagon. He turned to Elizabeth and Myra. "There's one last place we need to go." He drove them not toward town, but to a remote, windswept hill a few miles away. There, beneath a lone, gnarled juniper tree, was a small, unmarked grave, its simple wooden cross weathered by time. It was the grave of Thomas Blackwood and the boy whose death had set everything in motion. They stood before it in silence for a long time. The prairie wind whispered through the dry grass. Finally, Jedidiah reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out the tarnished silver star, his old U.S. Marshal badge. He looked at it for a moment, the symbol of a life of violence and duty, of pride and regret. Then he knelt and gently placed the badge on the mound of earth, resting it against the wooden cross. It was a final surrender, an act of letting go of the guilt, the anger, and the man he used to be. He rose and turned to Elizabeth, taking her hands in his. He was no longer a man haunted by shadows, but a husband and a father, ready to embrace the light. He looked at Myra, whose bright, innocent eyes held no memory of the terror, only the peace of this quiet hillside. "It's over," he said softly, and in those two words a lifetime of pain was laid to rest. As they turned to leave, Myra held up her small closed fist. "I have something," she said, her voice proud. She opened her hand. Lying in her palm was the silver locket. In the chaos of the saloon, she had picked it up. Elizabeth took it from her, her fingers trembling slightly as she clicked it open. Inside were two miniature portraits. On one side was a faded image of a woman she didn't recognize, Silas and Thomas's mother, perhaps. But on the other side was a tiny, clear photograph of a handsome young man with earnest eyes. Her husband, Daniel. Jedidiah and Elizabeth looked at it together. They acknowledged the man who had connected their pasts, the memory of his tragic mistake, and the love he had inspired. Then Elizabeth gently closed the locket. She would not discard it, but she would not let it define their future. It was a piece of their story, but it was not the end. Jedidiah lifted Myra into his arms and with his other arm wrapped securely around Elizabeth's waist, they walked back to the wagon. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the plains. They were three broken people who had found solace in one another, creating a home stronger than one built on blood alone. They faced the horizon, their future stretching before them, vast and full of promise, a testament to the quiet, unyielding power of redemption.